Recording in progress.
Yeah, it's loud. Okay, so we are doing a Genzo-e, a special session this weekend on Dogen's Fascicle Uji, which means being time. And so, it's kind of a dense fascicle, and when we're doing the workshop, we're just going to be like pedal to the metal. But for this talk, I thought it'd be nice to just tell you the story of Uji. And the story of Uji is basically about how Yaoshan became enlightened. And so we can talk about that. So Uji means being time. So in modern Japanese, when you read the characters, it is said arutoki, which means sometimes, like sometimes this happens, sometimes that happens. But when Dogen looked at the two characters in Chinese, he separated them into U and Ji. So U means being or existence, and Ji means time. So usually it's translated as being time. So I think a lot of people think about Uji when they hear that it's about being time. They think about Heidegger, something like that. They think it's some kind of Western philosophical treatise on the nature of being and time. But of course, that's not what it is, because Dogen is a Zen teacher. And I think everybody knows here it's 13th century in Japan. So Dogen's interest is how we become awakened. And that's not a philosophical treatise for him. It's an actual teaching on how we go about becoming awakened based on our understanding of what it means to be and what that time's relationship is to that beingness of ourselves, the world, and all things. So that's what the fascicle is about. Now the fascicle starts out with some couplets, and the first one is from Yaoshan, Yakusan Igen in Japanese. And Yaoshan is expressing his deepest understanding in these two lines. So the two lines are, "For the time being, I stand astride the highest mountain." And by the way, since it's Japanese, there are no pronouns. It could be, "For the time being, standing atop the highest mountain." "For the time being, I move on the deepest depths of the ocean floor." So those are the two opening lines of this text, which I'm not going to say anything about right now. I'll go back to at the end of the talk. Okay, so Dogen starts the fascicle, starts the teaching. He says, "In the 24 hours of your day, there is glorious radiance of the 16-foot Buddha," which just means of Buddha, of a Buddha. And it also includes this glorious radiance of the 24 hours of your day. It also includes the three-headed, eight-armed demon, which is a metaphor or a being that represents delusion. Okay, so in the 24 hours of our day, this golden radiance, komyo, is always presencing. No matter what we think is going on, it's always presencing, which includes Buddha, delusion, everything simultaneously. Okay, so that's pretty interesting teaching there. And I think in some ways, it's very encouraging. So, what does that mean? But Dogen says about this, he says, the problem is that we don't know what this teaching actually is. And so we don't know what to do with this information. So the problem, Dogen would say, is that I tell you that, and we don't know what to do with it. It's like, that's nice. Do we really believe that 24/7 we are Buddha? Come on, honestly, no, you don't believe that. So this teaching is interesting in that way, and it's also very encouraging. So he says, we go through our day with a kind of ignorance, and we recognize that time is passing. And we say, yeah, okay, I was got up this morning, time's gone by, I'm now here now. But we don't actually see the truth of that passing. We don't actually understand the dharmic importance of this time. So, and we don't understand that this passage is our spiritual journey. That this is what, and this is what he's going to talk about in Uji, is how this is our spiritual journey. So basically, we're just kind of going along and we don't think about it. And so Dogen says, and including that, we're not thinking about it. If we do think about it, the way we think about it is probably wrong. So no matter what you do, you're kind of like, what, up a creek without a paddle? So he's saying, we're not gonna understand this. And he says, this thinking that we have about the nature of being time will not bring us to an awakened state, will not bring us to what he calls great doubt in Zen, what we call great doubt. So the rest of the text is about how we should understand the nature of the essence of being time, which, by the way, are not two separate things. Conceptually, they're two separate things, but they're actually the same thing. So the way Dogen does this can be really hard to understand in the fascicle. So I'm kind of making this talk a little essence of what he does in the text. So he says, if we, what he calls setting ourselves out in array, if we set ourselves out in array, and this means that to set ourselves out in array means that we can deeply see and understand and listen to our experience as self and others together. And the self and others would be a situation, animals, chairs, anything. These are called Juhoid Dharma positions. Anything that you can kind of conceptualize and put a name to is this other that we're relating to, that we perceive as being outside the self, even though it's not. We are not outside itself, and we are not outside this self of our own self. Okay, so it's this interactive event. So this understanding he calls the beginning of our practice. And yet at the same time, it is also completely manifesting the complete practice itself, realization, nirvana, everything is still simultaneously manifesting. So everything's there for us right from the start. And therefore, the practice itself, because this is true, our practice itself is realization. So he talks about this a lot in Bendowa, but he also briefly kind of alludes to it in Uji. So we do not practice to become enlightened. We do not practice to engage in realized action. Our practice itself is a manifestation and expression of realization. Otherwise, why would we do the practice? We do it because the realized part of ourselves is asking us to do the practice. So we do the practice, and therefore it brings forth and manifests what is already presencing, which is our Buddha nature and that enlightened self that's there. So he says, if we get this, if we truly understand this, we're going to reside in a kind of communal, cooperative, inter-aring, enlightened relationships with everything, if we truly understand this. So exploring this isness of the world's process, how the world processes, functions, brings about codependency, co-arising, is again the beginning of practice. So we have to understand this fundamentally. This is kind of what we need to get fundamentally about everything, this universal sameness. So what is the universal sameness from a Buddhist point of view that we share? It is impermanence. Everything is impermanent. We should all be able to understand that, even though maybe we don't like it. We can see that everything is always changing. Things are codependent. Everything is in this interrelated relationship with each other, and that nothing has inherent existence. Nothing is outside this codependent functioning reality that's happening. And on top of that, everything is physically co-mingling. So what does that mean? It's kind of co-integrated. So for example, if you eat a carrot, that carrot becomes part of you on a cellular level. So you started out with thinking the carrot was something outside yourself, But when you ate the carrot, it became you. But this thing that you think is outside the self is never outside the self, even though it seems like it's outside the self. And yet simultaneously, it is independent of you. It has particularity. It has its own inherent existence. And yet, at the same time, it is completely commingling and with ourselves simultaneously as we are with it. This is kind of like pretty heady stuff, but this is according to Dogen and our teaching and other earlier Chan teachings. This is how the world is functioning. Okay, so the problem is we don't understand this well enough to actually act from this knowledge. And that's what is happening here. We don't understand that we think of our spiritual progress as a kind of steps and stages logical practice that goes from delusion to realization. That's kind of usually how we think about what we're up to. So, we come and we practice and we say, okay, well, if I sit this much zazen, or I do learn these rituals, or I do this, or I do that, somehow I'm making this progress going along from one thing to the next, from delusion to awakening. But Dogen says all of this codependent interbeing that he's talking about means that everything is already right there functioning for us in this delusion as realization already, that it's not something that we start here and get to over there, although we do, right? We do. And the fact that it is already presencing means that we don't have to wait for it to be something, He says in Busho, he says, the time right now the time has arrived. This is the time right now, which is the time that you're waiting for to arrive. But you don't need to wait for it to arrive because it's the time right now. So the practice is about being present right now and realizing that everything we need to pay attention to is actually arising and presenting itself to us now. We don't have to go out and look for this thing. It's happening right now. It's not in the past because the past is your memory. It's not in the future because the future hasn't happened. So the future is an idea. You cannot practice in the past and you cannot practice in the future. You can only practice in the present moment. And some people say, like Shahaku points out in his book, that even the practicing in the present moment is the remembering of the practicing in the present moment. But we'll leave that aside and just say that to practice in the present moment is to really presence yourself for what's happening right now. That is one of the primary things that are happening in Zazen. If you make the effort to keep coming back to the present moment, that is just letting yourself be presencing for what's arising. Birds, this talk, how you feel in your body, whatever it is, that you're actually there. And when we do that, we can set ourselves out in an array, which is to say we can actually listen. Jaku was talking about listening last week. We can actually listen and ground ourselves in the nature of the experiences that we're having right now, using our Dharma understanding to be able to actually respond to what's happening without, even though the past exists and we have memories and we have experiences, hopefully allowing ourselves, if those experiences are getting in the way of really presencing ourselves, that we can drop that experience, or we can acknowledge that experience and say, oh, that's going to get in the way. What can I do to help myself let go of this so it doesn't get in the way of this? Does this make sense? So this is the importance of really being present for your life as it is right now. So he also says that, and this is a teaching, many things, by the way, that Dogen says are not like his. He didn't think them up. He has a unique way of putting it together, but he is talking about teachings that have been around for hundreds of years before him. Okay, so just want you to know that he was a genius, but he didn't make this up on a whole cloth. So also delusion and realization are always functioning and presencing, right? They're not like, when we talk about suchness, when we talk about things just as they are, when we talk about setting the self out in array, when we talk about those things, we're not saying delusion isn't part of this. Like somehow all there's good stuff is over here and delusion is over here, and the good stuff doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. That's not true. So we include delusion in this. So everything about our life is included in these teachings. So we are not trying to get, I mean, we are trying to become more skillful, and in that sense, we're trying to get rid of delusion. But in some ways, I think as human beings, delusion is always going to be presencing. The question is, how do we respond to that? You know, Dogen says in Genjo Koan, what he says, in attachment, flowers fall. Flowers are going to die. Things are going to change. We're going to be attached to that. We don't want that. Now what? Now what do you do? How do you practice with that? Because that is the nature of being a human being, right? In aversion, weeds spread. Weeds are always going to be spreading. Maybe you feel like it's whack-a-mole. So how do we find equanimity in the midst of that? How do we find our practice in the midst of that? Okay, and then he says, you know, if we only understand our life as time, as being something like floating down a river, you know, we're in a boat, time is the river, and that kind of metaphor, then we're not going to completely engage our lives. We're not going to be able to incorporate the past, acknowledge our aspirations for the future in a way that embodies this practice, in a way that brings about skillfulness. And by the way, he calls this really being present. He calls this the eternal now. Nikon, we call it Nikon, the camera, right? I love this. It's like, why do they call the camera? It's actually pronounced in Japanese Nikon. Why do they call the camera Nikon? Because camera takes pictures now, 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 now. That's the eternal now of this life that we're experiencing. Okay, so we might understand these experiences of now, now, now as being sequential, but actually they're co-integrated with all being time throughout, all being time, all universal, everything is co-integrated or codependent with everything else. When does one moment become another moment? So you have a sense of that. We can say, well, this moment, our bodies kind of give us a sense of that. But when does one moment become another moment? They are like, you don't know, actually. In reality, there is no separation as these moments go from one moment to the next. So at the same time, though, there is this moment. And this moment is the moment that you're practicing in at the same time. So each moment has this sense of, right, I talked about the carrot, you eat the carrot, it becomes part of you. That each moment is like that process. Each moment is part of the moment that preceded it, and not part of the moment that preceded it like this, and this, but more like all of that throughout time and space. So when does one moment become another moment? So it's important to realize that our practice is completely rooted in what we're experiencing as the present moment, but simultaneously that moment is not sequential. And he talks about that in Uji as well. So that means that the moment of Buddha mind, the moment of our responding, I won't say Buddha mind, the moment that we're responding skillfully, where does your delusion go? And the moment that you're in delusion, where does your skillful mind go? Because it's not gone anywhere. So it's always presencing for us to access and go back and forth. So what is that moment from delusion? What is that moment from realization? Do we see it as sequential? But actually it's not sequential. Is your practice sequential? Actually, it's not sequential. Because all these things are coming together. All these things are functioning and commingling with each other to express in this moment what you understand about your practice. All of that is part of it. And yet simultaneously, there's this moment here. What are you doing now? Right now, right now, right now, right now. How are you responding? How are you understanding the nature of your experience? So that's also very important too. And it's important, according to Dogen, and this is for our practice in general, is that we make our best effort, right? That we make our best effort. Somebody said to me one time, they said, well, I know what the practice is, but I just didn't feel like doing it. Like, it's like, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I really don't want to do it. So maybe they weren't being lazy, maybe they're being like resistant. Like, when you should apologize, but you don't want to apologize because really you don't like that person, even though you're wrong. So the practice is to go and apologize. Now, if you really can't apologize, then the practice is to realize what's going on about the fact that you can't go and apologize, or to go to your teacher and say, I can't apologize. So, that you actually acknowledge that there's a problem and you work with that problem. So we're always making this effort. And this does not mean that, as what can't remember her name right now, the woman writes a poem about crawling across the desert on your hands and knees, right? Mary Oliver. This is not about abusing yourself, crawling across the desert. It's about intelligently paying attention to the nature of your experience and paying attention to precepts, let's say, paying attention to the things that are guidelines for us, and to realize, oh, yeah, I can't do this. I can't do this right now. How can I do this right now? That's making this effort. You still get to watch football. You still get to go for walks. You still get to, I don't know, have a glass of whiskey at night, whatever it is, all those bad things we're not supposed to do. But it's like, what is the thing that also brings you enjoyment? That's okay too. So this is not a draconian practice. But Dogen's saying, please make your best effort right now, because the world depends on it. Because everything is completely interconnected, because everything is commingling, that means that the whole world, all beings, are dependent upon our practice, as we are dependent upon the practice of all beings. It's this reciprocal event that Dogen calls Gyoji continuous practice. He says continuous practice makes the sun and the moon. This again is this completely interconnected space-time being functioning. And that is, this responsibility, this bodhisattva practice of, okay, it does make a difference what I do. And so, and Dogen also says, simultaneously, the world supports us in our practice. The whole world is supporting us. He calls it the divas right and left, the things you cannot see that are supporting us. Maybe just on a really relative level, the corn that's growing in Iowa that maybe we're going to eat next week, the things that are happening that we don't even know about. The tomatoes are growing in Mexico because they're not right time of the year here. And we go to the supermarket and we buy them. That tomato is supporting our life. That tomato is supporting our practice. So that all beings, even though we can't see them, are all supporting our practice. And then he ends the section, he says, do not force this practice. Don't force it into being. Okay, so there's a kind of flow, if you will. We're looking for a kind of ease in this, if you will. So it's not like forcing it. Don't force yourself into a box. And then don't make it nothing, which is, don't make it nihilistic. Don't say things like, it doesn't matter, but that we find that, well, the middle way, between this effort and letting things go. So now Dogen's kind of laid out his basic understanding at this point, which I have to tell you in the text is rather convoluted, but here in my little story about this, simplifying what's going on, now Dogen tells the story of Yaoshan. Now remember, Yaoshan was the guy who had the two opening lines in Uji that I talked about in the beginning. So Yaoshan, he went to the master Matsu. Now Yaoshan lived from 751 to 834, and Matsu lived from 709 to 788. So we're talking 8th century here. So Yaoshan goes to Matsu, and Yaoshan previously had been studying with a different teacher. And he goes to Matsu and he says, you know, he said, oh, well, let me back up and just say, both of these guys are really important teachers in our tradition, important ancestors. So Yaoshan goes to Matsu and he says, you know, I have a really good intellectual understanding of this practice. And then he lays out some things. And he says, but you know, I don't understand kind of like how it works. I don't kind of get the crux of this. And so Matsu, here's what he says to him. He says, for the time being, I let him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. For the time being, I don't let him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. For the time being, my letting him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes is correct. For the time being, my letting him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes is not correct. So that was Matsu's answer. You think Jaku and I can be enigmatic? And get this, Yaoshan was enlightened upon hearing these verses. And he said, well, before this happened, I was like a mosquito trying to bite an iron bowl, which for anybody who's been Shuso, you know that this is part of the Shuso ceremony. So this is maybe where it comes from this dialogue with Yaoshan and Matsu. Okay, so what is it that he got? That should be, I think we're all wondering, what is it exactly that Yaoshan understood? And by the way, this is, the whole rest of Uji now is about Yaoshan, these kind of verses, variations on these verses that Dogen comes up with. So what did he understand? He went from, by hearing these verses, he went from having a map of practice, like intellectual understanding of the practice, you know, I think I understand the practice. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, you know, here, let me get online. Do this, you know, like I'm following the map. So, and he's doing this, he says, well, I'm walking the path, I'm doing each step. But then what he understood was, no, that's not walking the path. Intellectual understanding is not walking the path. We have to actually get out there, feel the rocks, walk the path, get lost, find the path, maybe make a new path. But whatever it is that we're doing, we have to ground ourselves in the present moment and reality of our life as it is. So, and we have to have an intimate understanding of this practice that we're talking about. We have to have, based on understanding what Dogen said we didn't understand at the very beginning of the fascicle, based on this, we have to intuitively, we have to be able to, it's like riding a bike, right? Do you remember when you learned how to ride a bike or to drive a car? God forbid. Out in the parking lot at the mall or something, and I learned on a clutch. It was like I couldn't even turn in a giant parking lot. You know, you want me to turn? And it's like that. You know, when you first start out riding a bike or driving a car or doing something like that, you have to really think about it, which gets in the way. And then at some point, we have this intuitive understanding. I never think about that stuff now when I'm driving my car. Do you? Now I'm going to turn. Yeah. Now I'm going to turn the wheel. Oh, I hope the wheels turn when I turn the steering wheel. We don't even think about it. We just turn the wheel. And when we want to merge into traffic, there's a kind of intuitive sense that we have, like, okay, I've got this much space to merge in. Hopefully we get it right. Mm-hmm. So that's what we need. You know, that's what mature, realized, actualized practice is this way that we've incorporated this so that we can actually intuitively know at that moment what it is to do, what seems to be the right thing to do. I know a lot of famous teachers that over my course, not a lot, but some. And I have to say, even they say it's like, in some ways, you're never going to get it right 100% of the time. So we're not actually, I don't think maybe we're going for 100%, but I think we should acknowledge that weeds spread, flowers fall. So the important thing is that we're making this effort, right? We're making this effort. And the more we do the work of making this effort, the more intuitive it will become, right? So that is also functioning. So Dogen says about all this business of raising the eyebrow and blinking his eyes, and I let him and I don't let him. Basically, this is about responding to what's happening in the present moment. He says, at this time, in the time being, at this time, I let him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. Who is he? Who is raising their eyebrows and blinking their eyes? Is it the person who's speaking? Is it someone outside the self? So don't think he's necessarily talking about something that's going on outside the self. He's talking about the totality of that experience. And in the totality of that relational experience, the intimacy of that experience, sometimes it's appropriate to raise the eyebrows. Sometimes it's appropriate not to. So that's what he's talking about here. He's saying, how can you retain, know the intellect, do the intellect, let go of the intellect. And when the rubber meets the road, sometimes the eyebrows get raised and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's the right thing and sometimes it's not. That's basically what he's saying to him here. He's saying to respond with wisdom, and the wisdom side is this non-dual, intimate, non-dual isness of the relationship. And compassion is this complete inter-aring, as I like to say. Compassion is you eat the carrot and it becomes yourself. While at the same time, you're still yourself. That's important. But the thing is that this wisdom and compassion go together. And then out of this comes an appropriate response. So this response is going to respond to the particular needs of the moment, but also it incorporates the non-dual universality of the moment itself as well. It's hard to hold both of those things. So that's why this intuitive sense has to be developed, because you can't deconstruct a moment. Oh, let's see, this is the universal non-dual side, and I have the particular independent side here that there's a person in front of me, and yet simultaneously, they are also the non-dual side, which means that we are interpenetrating, interconnected, and codependent with each other. Therefore, I need to really listen to this, and then I'm going to respond in this way. It doesn't work that way, right? That's why we make this effort. That's why we do Zazen. Even though we don't know what the hell's going on in Zazen, we do Zazen because Zazen is a magic of making this happen. So that, that's that process. Okay, so Dogen sums up all this. He says, I encounter a person encounters a person, I encounter myself. I encounter a person encounters a person, I encounter myself. Going forth encounters going forth. If they do not obtain the time, it cannot be thus. I'm not going to explain what that is. So this is this map of practice that Dogen is laying out. I can't help myself. You encounter something you think is outside yourself. But actually, this person encountering the person is encountering the person who is encountering the person. And this is encountering the self as the person who you think you're outside yourself is actually encountering yourself as the self and as this person. That's why going forth encounters going forth, because when you're talking about going forth, now you've taken all the pronouns out of it, and it's just this moment happening and functioning, fourthness going forth with fourthness. Okay, so that's all simultaneously going on there. And they do not obtain the time if you cannot understand that this time and this being simultaneously are happening together, you cannot understand the nature of this encounter. So that's what Dogen's saying here when he says this. So what about the opening couplet of standing astride the highest mountain and walking on the deepest ocean floor? So this astride the highest mountain is the eternal now of Yaoshan saying, astride the highest mountain for the time being. This moment, Nikon, this moment, astride the highest mountain. Seeing the panoramic view of the totality of what is presencing itself at that moment. Then he says, walking in the depths of the ocean. He says, move on the deepest depths of the ocean. So there is this panoramic view, and simultaneously there is this deep presencing below the water. It's like going below everything and walking on the floor of the ocean. Those two things simultaneously need to happen together. And again, like I was just saying, you can't do it here when it needs to be done for the time being at this moment. At this moment, Yaoshan says, see the highest peak of the mountain, stand on the peak of the highest mountain, walk on the floor of the deepest ocean. And then he says, and he's also saying, sometimes on the peak, sometimes walking on the floor of the ocean. So, which is it, right? Both, because they both are simultaneously functioning together, and yet there is this moment of the highest mountain, standing on the highest mountain, and the moment of walking on the floor. So this is the deep intimacy of our life. This is Bodhisattva intention. This is the intention that we have as Bodhisattvas. This is Bodhisattva practice, is this willingness to presence ourselves as best we can for whatever's happening with the aim of alleviating suffering for self and others, with the aim of taking all of this interconnected being, time, interpenetrating, codependent arising, all of that stuff, and making it intimately ours so that we can see it in self and others. And that's how we alleviate suffering. That's how we bring about arraying the self with the world, is because we're able to do this. And out of this comes a kind of equanimity, right? And this equanimity allows us to really listen and be present and respond. Thank you. Okay, just stop the recording.